Hi everyone, it's Kurt again, and it's time for another video. This one is on standards-based assessment. So now we're looking at a more broader view of what it means to have standards-based assessment, and the pros of it, the cons of it. And then in the next chapter we're going to look more specifically at standardized testing, but I will refer to standardized tests a lot in this because the two are very well connected. We have the standards, and then we create the standardized test in order to assess them. But standards-based assessment is also very important for us, the language teacher, because our classroom tests should be based on some standards, whether that comes from our school or that comes from the government body, or whoever is in charge of language learning in our community. Okay, so let me jump right in then. So we'll start with our learning objectives. Remember, these are your learning objectives as we go through this chapter. And I wanted to say that actually I chose some highlights from this chapter and a few examples, but there's a lot of content in here. It's not that long of a chapter, but is a lot of detailed content. And I strongly suggest that you read this chapter carefully, because if you have any questions after watching my video, maybe you need to read all of it in order to fully understand this idea of standards-based assessment. Okay, anyway, so here are the objectives. So first is to understand how standards affects teaching and assessment. Okay, the second is to refer to a set of standards for a particular group and then apply them to your context. The third one is determine the purpose, the advantages, and the disadvantages of standards-based assessment. Fourth, to be able to use the principles of standardization for creating teacher-based standards. The fifth one is to evaluate the consequences, both positive and negative, of standards-based assessment. And lastly, to use this information to assure your own teaching and assessing is fair. Okay, so let's move on. So we'll start with a couple definitions and talk about what is the purpose of standards. Why do we have standards, and why do we have standardized tests? So standards basically are carefully defined competencies which relate to a course or a curriculum, year-long programs, or the entire education system. So standards-based assessment then are procedures designed to measure those aforementioned standards. So maybe the government creates the standards, which our government does. We have them in our curriculum guidelines. And then teachers create their classes in order for students to meet those standards, and then they create their assessments in order to test them. Or once you get to grade 9, the government assesses the students and determines what level they're at, as well as when you go into university with the entrance exams. And they are supposed to be assessing the students' knowledge or ability in the standards that they have created for all the schools of Taiwan. Okay. So what are the purposes then of standards? Well, standards allow for a connection between the standardized test specifications and the goals of educational programs. So they should match. What you're learning in school should match what's going to be on the standardized test, and they should promote each other, and they should promote language learning. So therefore, the standards become guidelines for curriculum, assessment, and instructional design. Basically, it's a map for students and teachers to know what they should be able to do and know. So if you think about it, it's just like what I talked about before with your test objectives, your class objectives, your course objectives. You create your objectives, and then you assess based on those objectives. You teach based on those objectives. It's the same with the standards, but the standards are set for the entire program or for the entire country or for the entire school. And then you design your course to meet those standards, and then you test based on those standards, so that when students finish grade 6, how successful were they at meeting the grade 6 level of English? Okay, so that's kind of the purpose of them. Now, standards-based education, just very briefly, so this happens all over the world. Countries create their own standards for language learning. So one of the common ones we know is the CEFR, and these standards are quite useful for teachers and students and universities and job workplaces, things like that, because they include these can-do descriptors for language learners so that they can gauge their own learning. And we can use those standards, the A2, the B1, the B2, the C1, to put people, not just students, at a certain level and say, okay, well, if you want to come to my country, you need to be B2. Or if you want to come to my university graduate program, you better be at least C1. And so students, they have, everything is very clear. Okay, C1, what do I need to be able to do? You can even take the practice tests to see which level you're at. And then students can create these expectations for themselves. Teachers as well. Okay, so let's have a look at some example standards. Sorry, give me a second. There we go. Okay, here are some example standards from SHORT. Now, these are for English learners, okay, and foreign or second language learners, so not for native speakers. So you can see here, they've got, you might want to pause this and read it more carefully. I'm just going to briefly explain it. But you've got the goals on the left-hand side. So goal number 1 is to use English to communicate in social settings. Okay, so that's a broad goal, right? But what are the standards? So students will use English to participate in social interactions. Students will interact in, through, and with spoken and written English for personal expression and enjoyment. And students will use learning strategies to extend their communicative competence. Okay, then goal number 2, to use English to achieve academically in all content areas, and then a number of standards. And number 3, to use English in socially and culturally appropriate ways. So, if these were our standards in Taiwan, for example, or maybe it was the universities, whatever or wherever they come from, then as a teacher, you would take these standards, and that's how you would design your courses to make sure that all of these standards are met by the time your students finish the program. Now, here's another one. This is from the California Board of Education, and this is talking about these are standards at different levels, and you can see they're quite detailed. So if you look at the first one, on the left-hand side, it's got the mode of communications. We've got collaborative, and then it's got interpretive, and then it's got productive. So it talks about working with people, interpreting information on your own, and then producing. So that could be written, could be spoken, right? And then it's got the level up here. So it's actually got a continuum from emerging to expanding to bridging and on, and it keeps going. Okay, and then for each one of these levels, it's got the early stages on the left-hand side and then the exit stage. So once they're exiting, emerging, and moving to expanding. So for collaborative, at the emerging level, they can express basic personal and safety needs and ideas and respond to questions on social and academic topics with gestures and words or short phrases. But to leave the emerging level, the same thing, but they can use phrases in short sentences. So see, it's really, really clear. So as a teacher, if you are assessing your own students, if you want to say that they've made it out of the emerging level, they have to be able to do all of these things. And if so, now they move to the expanding level. Okay, and then here are the early stages, and then here are the exit, and so on. Okay, so let's keep moving on then. So in standards-based assessment, we can, if we talk about standards-based assessment, not standardized testing. So using standards to create your assessment. Okay, there are pros and cons. Now the biggest pro is that we have this common criteria nationwide for teachers to refer to. So this is really good because if it actually works, but think about it. If Taipei has its own set of standards and theirs are way higher, and then Kaohsiungs are in the middle, and then Pingdongs are way down below. Then of course it depends what city you go to. That will determine the level that you get to, and that's not fair. It should be the same for everyone in theory. I know it doesn't really work that way, but so that's a pro. Now, what are some cons? Well, obviously the first one is that teachers will teach to the test, and this is a very, very big problem. So I know it's going to be on the test because I know what the standards are, and so I'm going to narrow my focus and I'm going to just make sure my students can do well on the test instead of doing what's best for the students and teaching what I think is the most important thing, which is the communication, the interaction, and really letting the students learn how to use the language. And this is the situation that we have in Taiwan. We know this. Everyone in here has heard me talk about it a lot, and you have witnessed it as a student as well. Okay, now, there's not only standards for language learners, there's also standards for teachers, okay? So here are teacher standards from Fenner and Kuhlman. Now, what they say is that teachers should also have their own assessment standards in 5 domains. So we should care about their language ability, their knowledge of culture, their ability in instruction, their ability in assessment. So are you able to actually assess the students? And of course, professionalism. Now, the book also shows another example, and this is from the University of California. So just like you, students who are studying in university and they are learning to become teachers or language teachers in the future. Now, there are many standards. They have 6, I think, in total. And the 6th one is assessment of student learning. So here are the standards for future teachers in terms of assessment, only assessment, not covering the other ones that I already talked about. So teachers need to be able to establish and communicate learning goals. Teachers need to be able to collect and use multiple sources to assess student learning. Teachers need to involve and guide students to assess their own learning. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. It should say involve and guide students to assess their own learning. 4th one, teachers should be able to use their assessment results to guide their own instruction. So how can I change my instruction based on my results? And the last one is that teachers need to be able to communicate with students and families about the student progress. So maybe students aren't doing well. How do you communicate with parents? This is actually also a very important skill. Okay, moving on. So what are the consequences of standards-based assessment and standardized testing? Remember this word consequence we talked about in the beginning. It also means impact. So what is the impact on education? How does it impact students? Well, of course, we can think about right away. One of the biggest impacts is that students have a lot of anxiety because they know everything's about a test. But here are some other ones. Now, most of these look negative. Obviously, there are some good consequences in that we can use results from standardized tests and we can put people into the correct group. And this is quite useful in most cases. I give you a proficiency test. Here's your score. This is the level you're at, and probably you will be successful. Okay. However, here are some other consequences. So the first one, as I mentioned before, is it narrows the curriculum because now the curriculum is only based on the standards, which are going to be tested. And what happens is students start to use mostly lower order cognitive skills, which means memorizing, remember, and understanding these type of skills. It's not critical thinking because they're memorizing. That's not good. Okay. The second is accountability issues. Now, the book talks a lot about in America where if schools overall have high scores, they get bonuses from the government and they get money. But if your scores are bad, you don't get money. And so in some cases, schools with students who are not good, they will hold them back and not let them test. They will make them do the grade again, hoping that students will drop out of school so that their scores will be higher because they're not taking the tests. Like, okay, now you're in grade 12, but you know what? You're not going to pass, so I'm going to make you do grade 12 again, hoping you quit school. Like, this stuff is terrible. So there's a lot of these type of issues. So actually, it can prohibit students from making progress because it's all about the test. It's not about, you know what? It's okay if you only get 55%. You used to be at 40% and now you're up to 55. That should be considered successful for some students. But if it's all about the test and you have to get a certain level based on the standards, then it doesn't matter. You didn't meet the standards, you're not good enough. And that can really hurt students. Okay, the fourth one is, as we know in Taiwan, people will pay a high price to succeed. So they will do whatever it takes. They'll get extra tutors, they will hire people to teach them how to apply and how to study and all these things. They will go to cram school classes. But is that really what education should be? Should it be that you have to pay a bunch of money in order to get a good score? Or shouldn't it just be that you go to school and you learn and that's it? Okay, and then the last one is it starts to be more about extrinsic motivation instead of intrinsic, because I study to get a good score, not I study because I want to better myself. And almost every type of research says intrinsic motivation leads to much more successful learning. Okay, some questions that we should think about in terms of standards-based assessment and standardized testing. So how about students who are not fairly assessed? What if you're the type of student who just doesn't do well on a standardized test? And there are plenty of examples of very intelligent people who just don't do well on these kind of tests. So how about them? Should we, for example, maybe I'm just not good at memorizing terms, but I'm an extremely good critical thinker and I can problem solve. So does that mean that this person who can memorize all the vocabulary, they have more of a photographic memory, so they get a better score, so they're going to be better than me in the workplace? Is that really fair? So should we consider more performance types of evaluation as well? And the third one I think is really important. Will students lose their creativity in this type of examination culture? Because the focus is always on remembering the information instead of creating something new. And does this type of system benefit the wealthy? Obviously, I think it does. I mean, I already talked about the money. I mean, if you can go to a private school, if we're talking about English, but not only English, if you can go to a private school and go to these, get a tutor, of course, your scores get better. But this is not a Taiwan only thing. This is a worldwide problem. Okay, next one is test bias. So test bias basically is when a test is unfair for a particular group of people. Now, it could be based on language, it could be culture, it could be race, gender, learning style, age, etc. I gave an example in class about the Pokemon Go question on GPT for someone I knew who had no idea what Pokemon Go was. And so she had a very difficult time to answer the question. Okay, so here's an example from IELTS. It's an essay prompt, and it goes like this. You rent a house through an agency. The heating system has stopped working. You phoned the agency a week ago, but it has still not been mended. Write a letter to the agency, explain the situation, and tell them what you want them to do about it. Okay, so maybe you don't think there's a problem with this question, but according to the textbook, the biggest problem here is that maybe in the culture of the people taking it, they don't have agencies that you can rent houses through. And furthermore, perhaps writing a letter to complain is not something that they will do in their country. And so they're totally unfamiliar with what you would say and how you would compose such a letter. I know I've personally run into this in Taiwan where I've wanted to complain and people that I know tell me, we don't do that here. And I was thinking, so if I do it, then does that make me a terrible person, even though I feel like I should? And so culture definitely plays a part. Now, I may also argue that in Taiwan, there's no heating systems here. People don't have them in their houses. So will they feel like this is something they just can't relate to? So it's test bias. Okay. All right, and that is the last one. So as a teacher, there's some more information after this slide in your textbook. There's a couple more sections that I didn't put in here that I think it's better that you just read it instead of me trying to just retell the whole story. But what's important, just to conclude, is as a teacher, you have to make sure that if you're following this idea of standards-based assessment, you're following the Ministry of Education's curriculum guidelines, that you still try to think about what's the best way for the students to learn without narrowing your curriculum, without test bias, creating fair evaluations of everybody in your classroom's ability. All right, everybody, that's it for this video. Hope you all are doing well, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.